In June 1944, the Allied Supreme Command deliberately placed General George S. Patton at the head of an army that did not exist. It was called the 1st U.S. Army Group. It was stationed in southeast England. And it never intended to land anywhere. While thousands of real soldiers prepared to storm Normandy, Allied planners invested enormous resources into inflatable tanks, fake landing craft, simulated headquarters, and radio traffic meant for enemy ears only. German intelligence watched. German command listened. And German divisions stayed exactly where the Allies needed them to stay, far from the real battlefield. But why did this work? Why would one of the most cautious military commands in history anchor its strategic reserves to an army that was never real? And more dangerously, why did the Allies choose a strategy where a single misread signal could have collapsed the entire invasion? Because FUSAG was not a trick. It was a calculated assault on how an enemy thinks, decides, and hesitates, and it carried a cost few planners were willing to admit. The strategic problem facing the Allied command in 1944 was not how to land in France. It was how to survive the first 72 hours after doing so. An amphibious invasion across the English Channel was, by definition, fragile. The landing force would be exposed, logistically stretched, and tactically constrained by tides, weather, and limited ports. If German armored reserves moved decisively and early, the invasion could be contained, or destroyed, before it became irreversible. The Allies understood this. They also understood something more unsettling. There was no operational brilliance that could fully solve this problem once the landings began. The decisive phase would occur before the first soldier touched the beach. This is where FUSAG enters the picture, not as deception in the traditional sense, but as a strategic wager against enemy decision-making. The plan did not seek to hide the Normandy landings. It sought to delay the German response long enough for reality to solidify. That is what makes this strategy fundamentally unorthodox. The Allies were not betting on firepower, maneuver, or speed. They were betting that German command would choose not to act, even when action was still possible. And that raises the question that defines everything that follows. What kind of strategic environment forces a coalition to stake an invasion on the enemy's hesitation, rather than its own strength? This was not a symmetrical confrontation. It was a contest shaped by imbalance, constraints, and mutual fear of being wrong. On one side stood the Allied coalition, Britain, the United States, Canada, and their partners, possessing overwhelming industrial capacity, air superiority, and maritime control. On paper, they had the tools required to breach Fortress Europe. In reality, their freedom of action was far narrower than it appeared. Because an invasion force crossing the Channel could only move forward. Retreat was not a real option. The geography dictated everything. The English Channel compressed maneuver space. Normandy offered beaches, but not ports. The first days would rely on artificial harbors, vulnerable supply lines, and weather windows that could not be negotiated. Every additional German division arriving early increased the probability that the invasion would stall before it could expand. Time was the most unforgiving constraint. Not months. Not weeks. Hours. Politically, the Allies were under pressure from every direction. The Soviet Union demanded a second front. Domestic audiences expected action after years of preparation. Delay was not just operationally risky, it was strategically corrosive. Every postponement raised doubts about resolve and credibility. And yet, speed created its own danger. A rushed invasion that triggered an immediate German concentration would be catastrophic. Across the Channel, the German position was paradoxical. Germany was strategically overstretched, fighting on multiple fronts, suffering from air interdiction and material shortages. But in Western Europe, it still retained something extremely dangerous: intact field formations and mobile armored reserves. German doctrine emphasized counterattack. If an enemy landed, the correct response was not passive defense, it was rapid, decisive concentration at the point of main effort. Crush the beachhead before it could stabilize. That logic was sound. The question was not whether to counterattack, but where and when. And this is where the strategic map becomes distorted. The German command did not see the Channel as a single problem. They saw multiple potential invasion corridors. Normandy was one. Southern France was another. But Pas-de-Calais dominated their thinking. Not because it was certain, but because it was logical. Pas de Calais was the shortest crossing. It offered proximity to German supply networks, better infrastructure, and a direct access toward vital industrial regions. From a doctrinal perspective, it made sense. From an intelligence perspective, it aligned with years of expectation. The Allies understood this mental geography intimately. They did not need to invent a German obsession with Calais. They needed only to reinforce it. This created a dangerous asymmetry of perception. The Allies saw Normandy as a temporary vulnerability that could become irreversible if German reaction was delayed. The Germans saw Calais as the decisive point that justified holding reserves back, even as evidence accumulated elsewhere. This gap between reality and expectation was the battlefield FUSAG would occupy. But constraints existed on both sides. German command suffered from fragmented authority. Strategic reserves were controlled at the highest levels. Field commanders lacked autonomy to redeploy armored divisions without approval. This slowed response time and amplified uncertainty. A wrong decision could not be easily corrected. At the same time, German intelligence was not blind. They intercepted signals. They observed movements. They tracked Allied preparations across southern England. The problem was not lack of information. The problem was excess information pointing in different directions. Every indicator required interpretation. And interpretation required assumptions. The Allies, by contrast, were unified, but fragile in a different way. Coalition warfare required consensus. British and American planners had to align doctrine, priorities, and risk tolerance. FUSAG was not merely a military plan. It was a political commitment to a shared illusion. If it failed, blame would not fall on a single commander. It would fracture trust across the alliance. This is the often missed reality of the situation. FUSAG did not simplify the strategic picture. It made it more complex. The Allies were deliberately injecting ambiguity into a system already saturated with uncertainty, and trusting that the enemy would resolve that ambiguity in the wrong direction. This required precise calibration. Too subtle, and it would be ignored. Too obvious, and it would trigger suspicion. And beneath all of this lay the most uncomfortable constraint of all. The Allies could not test this strategy. There was no rehearsal. No partial success. No rollback. Once the invasion began, the deception would either hold or collapse completely. The strategic map, therefore, was not a chart of terrain and forces. It was a map of assumptions, delays, authorities, and psychological thresholds. The Allies were not asking, "Where will Germany fight?" They were asking, "Where will Germany refuse to commit?" And that reframes everything. Because the most dangerous opponent is not one who attacks too early, but one who waits too long for a certainty that never comes. And it was inside these constraints, geographical, political, doctrinal, and psychological, that a decision emerged which no standard military manual would ever recommend. Military doctrine exists to reduce uncertainty. It codifies experience into principles that can be applied under pressure. In 1944, both sides possessed doctrine that was internally coherent, historically validated, and, in this situation, dangerously misleading. From a conventional perspective, the Allied course of action was straightforward. Identify the strongest point of landing. Concentrate overwhelming force. Suppress enemy defenses. Secure a port as quickly as possible. Expand the lodgment before the enemy can react in strength. This logic favored clarity. One main effort. One decisive axis. Minimal ambiguity. Under this framework, deception played a supporting role. It could mask the timing of an invasion. It could obscure minor details. But it was never meant to determine where the enemy placed its strategic reserves. Doctrine assumed that decisive force, once revealed, would override deception almost immediately. That assumption was critical. And it was wrong. If the Allies had followed doctrine cleanly, they would have faced a structural contradiction. Concentrating visible preparations near Normandy would have increased operational readiness, but it would also have invited immediate German reaction. The very clarity doctrine demanded would have accelerated the enemy's response. German doctrine mirrored this logic from the opposite direction. It emphasized early identification of the enemy's main effort, followed by rapid counterattack using armored reserves. Delay was considered fatal. Waiting too long meant losing the initiative permanently. But German doctrine also carried an unspoken dependency: centralized decision-making. Strategic reserves were held back to avoid premature commitment. Authority flowed upward, not outward. Field commanders could observe, but not decide. In theory, this ensured coherence. In practice, it created latency. Doctrine assumed that clarity would arrive in time for decisive action. It did not account for a situation in which clarity itself could be engineered, selectively, convincingly, and falsely. This is where both systems began to fail simultaneously. The Allies faced a doctrinal dead end. They could not concentrate openly without triggering the response they most feared. They could not disperse indefinitely without losing momentum, political credibility, and weather windows. Germany faced a different trap. Its doctrine required confirmation before commitment. But confirmation depended on intelligence signals that could be manipulated. The system was robust against surprise attacks, not against prolonged, plausible ambiguity. Standard doctrine on both sides assumed good faith interaction with reality. Neither side's manuals contemplated an opponent willing to invest vast resources into constructing a false strategic center of gravity. This is the deeper reason FUSAG appears clever in hindsight but irrational in foresight. From a doctrinal standpoint, it violated economy of force. It violated concentration principles. It violated risk management norms. No manual advised creating a phantom army larger than many real ones, then anchoring enemy expectations to it. And yet, every doctrinally sound alternative led to the same outcome: a faster German reaction to Normandy. At this point, Allied planners were not choosing between good and bad options. They were choosing between incompatible risks. One risk was visible, familiar, and doctrinally acceptable: accept heavy losses in the opening days and trust in material superiority to prevail. The other was abstract, unfamiliar, and institutionally uncomfortable: attempt to shape the enemy's perception so deeply that they would delay acting even when action was rational. Doctrine offered no guidance for that choice. It could only warn against it. This is the moment where analysis must shift from how armies fight to how decisions are made under uncertainty. Because FUSAG did not emerge from doctrine. It emerged from recognizing doctrine's blind spot. The planners were no longer asking how to defeat German forces. They were asking how to immobilize German decision-making. And that required abandoning the safety of established rules. Which raises the central question of the next phase: who was willing to propose a strategy that openly contradicted everything they had been trained to trust, and why was it approved? This decision did not appear fully formed. It emerged under pressure, through hesitation, resistance, and an uncomfortable realization: every safe option led to unacceptable risk. Within the Allied command structure, no single individual owned the idea of FUSAG in isolation. It was not the product of a lone visionary. It was the result of an institutional process slowly conceding that conventional planning had reached its limits. At the highest level, Allied leadership agreed on one thing early: the invasion would fail if German armored reserves were released immediately and decisively. That premise was not controversial. What followed was: early deception concepts were conservative. Diversions. Feints. Misleading signals designed to obscure timing. These were familiar tools. They fit doctrine. They reassured planners that control was being maintained. But as simulations and staff analyses progressed, a more troubling pattern appeared. Even under optimistic assumptions, partial deception brought only marginal delays. Hours. Perhaps a day. Not enough. To achieve a meaningful delay, German command would need to believe that Normandy was not merely a landing, but a secondary one. And belief, at that level, could not be generated through small lies. This was the inflection point. The discussion shifted from how do we hide Normandy to how do we make somewhere else more convincing. That distinction mattered. One was defensive. The other was constructive. It required inventing a strategic reality that could withstand scrutiny. Resistance was immediate. From a staff perspective, the proposal was alarming. Creating a fictitious army on the scale envisioned for FUSAG required resources that could be used elsewhere. Personnel. Equipment. Planning bandwidth. Communications infrastructure. All diverted to something that, by definition, would never fight. The objections were not philosophical. They were practical. What if German intelligence detected inconsistencies? What if signals traffic was intercepted but misinterpreted? What if a double agent failed, defected, or hesitated? What if the deception became so elaborate that it constrained real operations? These were not hypothetical concerns. Each represented a potential single point of failure. And yet, the alternative was worse. The planners were forced into a reframing. They stopped asking whether FUSAG was risky. They asked whether not doing it was survivable. At this stage, three core assumptions crystallized, assumptions that no doctrine could validate, but which the entire strategy depended upon. The first assumption was psychological, that German command would prioritize coherence over speed. That when faced with ambiguous indicators, they would delay commitment rather than act on incomplete certainty. This was not an insult to German competence. It was a recognition of institutional behavior. Centralized authority, combined with fear of strategic misallocation, created hesitation as a rational response. The second assumption was informational, that German intelligence systems, while technically capable, were vulnerable to confirmation bias. They did not need to be deceived from scratch. They needed to be reinforced along existing expectations, particularly regarding Pas-de-Calais. The third assumption was internal, that the Allied coalition could maintain discipline. That every participant, from senior commanders to radio operators to double agents, would sustain the illusion without deviation. This was the most fragile assumption of all. Because unlike conventional operations, there was no redundancy. A real army can absorb mistakes. A fictitious one cannot. Every inconsistency threatened exposure. Approval did not come easily. Senior commanders understood the reputational risk. If the invasion failed, FUSAG would not be remembered as a bold strategy. It would be remembered as institutional self-deception. A case study in how planners convinced themselves that imagination could replace force. And yet, authority converged around the idea. Not because it was elegant. Not because it was clever. But because it directly targeted the only variable the Allies could not otherwise control, when Germany would commit its reserves. This is where General George S. Patton entered the picture, not as a battlefield commander, but as a strategic signal. Patton's assignment to FUSAG was not about leadership. It was about credibility. In German eyes, Patton represented aggression, momentum, and decisive action. Placing him anywhere automatically elevated that location's perceived importance. This choice intensified internal anxiety. Patton was unpredictable. Public. Volatile. Any unscripted remark could undermine months of preparation. His presence strengthened the deception and magnified its vulnerability. By the time FUSAG was formally integrated into invasion planning, the nature of the decision had changed. This was no longer a deception plan supporting an invasion. The invasion plan now depended on deception. From that moment onward, the Allies were committed. They could refine the illusion. They could strengthen it. But they could not retreat from it without unraveling their own logic. The decision had crossed a threshold. What remained was the hardest part, translating an abstract strategic gamble into a functioning system, one that could survive continuous enemy scrutiny without collapsing under its own complexity. And that raises the next question: how do you make an army that does not exist behave convincingly enough to hold an enemy's attention, day after day, signal after signal, without ever revealing itself as empty? Once the decision was made, the nature of the problem changed completely. This was no longer a question of strategic theory. It was a question of systems engineering under hostile observation. An army that does not exist cannot improvise. It must behave perfectly, because it has no margin for error. The execution of FUSAG required the Allies to simulate not strength, but routine. Real armies are messy. They generate noise, inefficiency, redundancy, and friction. Ironically, that messiness was exactly what FUSAG needed to replicate. Too clean, and it would look artificial. Too chaotic, and it would collapse into contradiction. The first layer was physical presence. Camps appeared across southeast England. Vehicles occupied fields. Landing craft gathered near the coast. From the air, the pattern was deliberate, dispersed but coherent, large enough to imply preparation, restrained enough to avoid triggering immediate alarm. But these objects were not the deception. They were scaffolding. What mattered was what these objects justified. Every tank, inflatable or wooden, existed to explain a photograph. Every camp existed to justify supply movement. Every visible concentration existed to legitimize something more important: communications. Radio traffic became the backbone of the illusion. Signals units generated transmissions that matched what German intelligence expected from an army of that size. Call signs, traffic density, command hierarchies, all calibrated to appear routine rather than urgent. This was not random noise. It was structured boredom. That distinction mattered. Urgency attracts scrutiny. Routine sustains belief. The challenge was scale. A formation the size of FUSAG required a communications footprint consistent over time. Sudden spikes would suggest preparation for imminent action. Sudden silence would suggest deception. The rhythm had to feel alive, but not decisive. At the same time, nothing transmitted could conflict with known Allied activity elsewhere. The real invasion force preparing for Normandy also generated signals. The two systems had to coexist without exposing each other. This created a constant risk of internal contradiction. A single misaligned message could raise questions. A delayed transmission could imply movement that did not occur. A careless overlap could suggest duplication. Every day, FUSAG had to survive scrutiny not by brilliance, but by absence of anomaly. The second layer was human confirmation. German intelligence did not rely solely on signals or aerial reconnaissance. It relied on people. Reports from neutral countries. Observations from sympathizers. Most critically, intelligence from double agents. These agents were not asked to invent dramatic revelations. They were asked to confirm what already seemed plausible. Their reports were incremental. Boring. Consistent. This was intentional. Large lies fail when they move too fast. FUSAG advanced one assumption at a time. Yet this created a dangerous dependency. The deception's credibility became concentrated in a small number of individuals operating under immense pressure. If one agent hesitated, embellished, or contradicted the broader narrative, the damage would ripple outward. There was no way to fully control this. Trust replaced redundancy. The third layer was command visibility. An army without visible leadership is suspicious. German analysts expected identifiable command behavior. Inspections. Movements. Patterns associated with senior officers. This is where Patton's presence became operationally relevant. His location anchored the illusion. Wherever Patton appeared, or was reported to appear, it signaled intent. But this required careful containment. Too much visibility risked drawing attention. Too little undermined credibility. Patton was, in effect, a moving liability. He strengthened the narrative by existing within it, and threatened it by being human. Execution, therefore, became an exercise in constraint. Planners were not asking how to make FUSAG more convincing. They were asking how to prevent it from becoming too convincing in the wrong ways. If German command concluded that FUSAG was about to land imminently, it might trigger a preemptive response that disrupted the Normandy timetable. This was the paradox at the heart of execution. The deception had to be strong enough to delay German commitment, but weak enough to avoid provoking it. Failure points existed everywhere. Weather changes could disrupt aerial patterns. Real Allied troop movements could intersect with fake ones. Operational security breaches could introduce noise that planners did not anticipate. Even success carried risk. The longer the deception held, the more German command would search for confirmation. Scrutiny would intensify, not diminish. At several moments, the system came close to unraveling. Intelligence assessments fluctuated. German analysts questioned whether Normandy might be a diversion. Some commanders argued for immediate concentration. Others urged restraint. These debates were not controlled by the Allies. They could only influence the inputs, not the conclusions. This is often misunderstood. FUSAG did not manipulate German decisions directly. It constrained the range of decisions that felt safe. And that constraint depended on maintaining a delicate balance between plausibility and restraint, day after day, without relief. By the time Allied troops landed in Normandy, FUSAG had already done its work. Not by forcing a reaction, but by suppressing one. But the outcome was still undecided. Because deception does not end when reality begins. It ends when the enemy accepts reality. Which leads to the most dangerous phase of all. How did German command interpret the landings, and why did they continue to wait, even after the real invasion was underway? When Allied forces landed in Normandy, the deception was supposed to begin collapsing. Reality had arrived. Beaches were contested. Casualties mounted. Reports flooded German command channels. And yet, the decisive reaction did not come. This is the most misunderstood moment of the entire operation. The German failure was not one of ignorance. It was one of interpretation. German command did not doubt that an invasion was underway. What they doubted was its meaning. From the first hours, German intelligence registered the landings. Signals confirmed it. Field reports confirmed it. There was no denial. But the central question was not, is this happening? It was, is this the main effort? And here, FUSAG exerted its most lethal influence. The German command system was conditioned to expect deception. They assumed the Allies would attempt diversion. Normandy, from this perspective, fit a familiar pattern, a costly feint designed to draw forces away from the decisive blow elsewhere. This assumption did not emerge in a vacuum. It was reinforced by everything German intelligence believed it knew. First, Pas de Calais still made sense. It remained the shortest crossing. It still offered better infrastructure. It still aligned with Allied incentives. Nothing about Normandy erased that logic. Second, FUSAG still existed, at least on paper. Signals traffic continued. Reports from agents remained consistent. Patton had not moved. From a German perspective, the absence of activity from FUSAG was not reassuring. It was suspicious. Why would the Allies commit their strongest, most aggressive commander to inactivity while launching their decisive operation elsewhere? The answer German planners arrived at was rational, and wrong. They concluded that Normandy was the opening move, not the culmination. A necessary sacrifice to draw attention, exhaust defenses, and create confusion before the real invasion landed in Calais. This interpretation explains the delay more clearly than any notion of incompetence. German command was not paralyzed. It was calculating. The structural features of German decision-making amplified this tendency. Authority over armored reserves remained centralized. No single commander could commit them without approval. Each request for movement required justification, confirmation, and consensus. In a system already biased toward caution, ambiguity became an anchor. Field commanders in Normandy reported urgency. They requested reinforcements. They described mounting pressure. But their reports competed with a larger strategic narrative, one in which committing reserves too early would expose Calais to catastrophe. Every hour that passed without movement from FUSAG reinforced this fear. German planners were not waiting because they were blind. They were waiting because they believed restraint was discipline. This is the critical error. They treated uncertainty as a reason to delay, when uncertainty was precisely the condition the Allies had engineered. The absence of confirmation was interpreted as a warning sign, not an opportunity. The moment of decision drifted upward, away from the battlefield, into layers of command where abstraction replaced immediacy. By the time German reserves began to move in earnest, the window had closed. Allied forces had established depth. Logistics stabilized. Air superiority punished movement. The fragile phase had passed. FUSAG did not stop the German response. It delayed it just long enough. And that distinction matters. This was not a collapse of German capability. It was a failure of strategic timing under informational pressure. A system designed to avoid catastrophic error ended up committing one, not by acting rashly, but by refusing to act decisively when action was still viable. The deception succeeded because it aligned perfectly with German fear of being wrong. But this outcome invites a dangerous simplification, that the strategy worked cleanly, elegantly, without cost. That is not true. Because the delay purchased by FUSAG came at a price, one paid not in abstraction, but in lives, resources, and long-term consequences that are rarely discussed. And to understand the true nature of this strategy, we have to confront what it cost, and what would have happened if even one assumption had failed. The immediate outcome is well known, but often misunderstood. German armored reserves did not strike Normandy with full strength in the opening days. The Allied beachhead held. Logistics followed. Airfields were built. Momentum shifted. From that point forward, the invasion became a campaign rather than a gamble. FUSAG achieved its primary objective, delay. But delay is not free. The success of the deception did not eliminate risk. It redistributed it, unevenly and brutally. On the beaches, Allied units paid the price of time bought elsewhere. Casualties in the opening phase were not reduced by deception, they were absorbed by it. The strategy assumed that losses could be sustained long enough for the illusion to hold. This is the first hidden cost. The planners accepted that men landing in Normandy would face the consequences of a strategic bet made far from the shoreline. If German reserves had arrived earlier, casualties would have increased. But even with delay, the price was severe. The second cost was logistical distortion. Resources devoted to sustaining FUSAG were not symbolic. Personnel, planning capacity, communications infrastructure, and equipment were tied to an army that would never fight. These were assets unavailable elsewhere. The Allied command accepted inefficiency as the cost of credibility. This decision narrowed margins. Any unexpected shortfall in real operations could not be compensated easily. Flexibility was sacrificed for coherence. The third cost was political exposure. Had the invasion failed or stalled, FUSAG would not have been remembered as innovation. It would have been framed as deception run amok, evidence that Allied leadership had misjudged the balance between imagination and force. Responsibility would have been diffuse, but blame would not have been. Trust between coalition partners would have suffered. Future joint operations would have been constrained by suspicion. The fourth cost was psychological and long-lasting. Senior commanders carried the burden of uncertainty without confirmation. There was no feedback loop. No indicator of success until it was already irreversible. Every hour of silence could be interpreted as success or impending failure. This kind of pressure does not appear in after-action reports. But it shaped decisions, tempered aggression, and reinforced caution in subsequent planning. The memory of how close the strategy came to collapse lingered long after victory was secured. Finally, there is the cost of precedent. FUSAG demonstrated that large-scale deception could shape strategic outcomes. But it also created a dangerous lesson, that perception could substitute for force. This is where interpretation becomes contentious. If even one assumption had failed, if German command had decentralized authority, if intelligence skepticism had prevailed, if a double agent had faltered, the result would not have been partial failure. It would have been catastrophic. Normandy would have faced concentrated resistance. The invasion might have been contained. And the existence of FUSAG would have magnified the sense of strategic miscalculation. The strategy did not fail because it was fragile. It succeeded despite being fragile. That distinction matters. Because fragility is not eliminated by success. It is only concealed by it. The Allies did not prove that deception is superior to force. They demonstrated that under specific conditions, centralized authority, cognitive bias, informational saturation, deception can delay force long enough to matter. But this conclusion is incomplete. To understand what FUSAG truly represents, we must move beyond outcome and cost, and ask a harder question: what, exactly, did this strategy change about how wars are decided? And that brings us to the final phase, the strategic meaning of FUSAG beyond 1944. By the time the war moved inland, FUSAG had already disappeared as an operational concern. But as a strategic event, it did not end in 1944. Because FUSAG was not fundamentally about deception. It was about decision paralysis engineered at scale. The common interpretation frames FUSAG as an exercise in misdirection, fake armies, false signals, staged evidence. That view focuses on tools. It misses the mechanism. The real mechanism was this: the Allies deliberately constructed a situation in which acting decisively felt more dangerous to German command than waiting. That inversion is the core strategic achievement. German planners did not refrain from action because they lacked information. They refrained because every available option carried the risk of irreversible error. Commit reserves to Normandy, and Calais might fall undefended. Commit to Calais, and Normandy might become permanent. Hold back, and clarity might emerge. FUSAG was designed to ensure that clarity never arrived in time. This reveals the first principle that FUSAG quietly established. Strategic paralysis is not created by confusion alone. It is created when every option appears rational, and none appear safe. This is why the strategy depended so heavily on reinforcing German expectations rather than inventing new ones. FUSAG did not challenge German doctrine. It hid inside it. It allowed German planners to believe they were being cautious, disciplined, and methodical, even as they were being delayed. The second principle is more uncomfortable. FUSAG demonstrates that control over an enemy's decision tempo can matter more than control over terrain, but only when the enemy's command structure is centralized, risk-averse, and confirmation-dependent. This was not a universal insight. It was a conditional one. Had German field commanders possessed autonomy to commit reserves immediately, FUSAG would have collapsed. Had intelligence analysis prioritized disconfirmation over coherence, the illusion would have weakened. Had strategic authority been distributed rather than concentrated, delay would not have been systemic. In other words, this strategy worked not because it was clever, but because it matched the enemy's institutional psychology with precision. The third principle is the most dangerous to misunderstand. FUSAG did not prove that perception can replace force. It proved that perception can buy time, and that time can be decisive only if force is already prepared to exploit it. The deception did not win Normandy. Normandy won because troops landed, held ground, absorbed losses, and built momentum under fire. If the real invasion force had been weaker, slower, or less resilient, no amount of deception would have compensated. The strategy did not reduce the need for sacrifice. It only delayed the moment when sacrifice peaked. This is why attempts to generalize FUSAG into a timeless formula often fail. In later conflicts, adversaries learned to decentralize decision-making. They learned to act under uncertainty. They learned to treat ambiguity as a trigger, not a restraint. The conditions that made FUSAG viable were historically specific. And yet, its strategic meaning endures. FUSAG forces a re-evaluation of how wars are decided at the highest level. It shows that under certain constraints, the decisive battlefield is not physical space, but the interval between detection and commitment. It also exposes a quiet truth that military institutions rarely admit. That rational systems, designed to prevent catastrophic mistakes, can be induced to make them by waiting too long. This is not a lesson about deception. It is a lesson about risk distribution. The Allies accepted visible, immediate risk on the beaches in exchange for invisible, delayed risk in German headquarters. They wagered that the enemy would choose the opposite distribution, minimizing short-term danger at the cost of long-term collapse. That wager paid off. But it was never safe. Never stable. Never repeatable on demand. And that is why FUSAG remains unsettling. Not because it was ingenious, but because it worked by exploiting something far more fragile than military hardware. It worked by exploiting how intelligent organizations hesitate when certainty is denied. The first U.S. Army group never fired a shot. It never crossed the channel. It never existed. And yet, its shadow shaped one of the most consequential campaigns of the 20th century. FUSAG was not a triumph of illusion over reality. It was a confrontation between two ways of managing uncertainty, and a demonstration that, under pressure, hesitation can be engineered as deliberately as attack. History remembers the beaches of Normandy. It rarely remembers the weeks when nothing happened in southeast England, and how much depended on that nothing holding together. That silence was not empty. It was constructed, maintained, risked. And it reminds us of something uncomfortable. Wars are not always decided by who moves first, or who hits hardest. Sometimes, they are decided by who convinces the other side to wait, just a little too long.